You are listening to the History Bards podcast. Thank you for joining us today as we delve into the history behind the enthralling World War II historical novel, Moral Fibre by Helena P. Schrader. Helena had the incredible opportunity to interview World War II pilot Kit Moran, who flew with the Royal Air Force in Britain at a very crucial time in the war. In using his incredible story, Helena developed her novel and immerses the reader in the fear-inspiring conflicts many of the RAF pilots faced during that time. And not only that, but what many of the women left on the ground, those who fell in love with RAF pilots, had to face every day with the prospect of never seeing their loved one again. As we will hear later in this episode, Ms. Schrader's story highlights the emotional, physical, and mental strain these brave pilots faced every time they stepped foot inside the cockpit. And not only for themselves, but for the entire crew who teamed together to fly the nightly bombing raids across the war-ravaged lands of France and Germany. Now, here is a bit of history behind Ms. Schrader's book. Britain, before the war, emerged from the First Great War as a hope-filled beacon for the world, and the development from the early Victorian days gave way to jazz-filled clubs and updated fashions, and young women in search of independence. The young men of the day, especially those keeping attuned to the political horizon, knew of the impending roar from Germany as Hitler rose to power. When Great Britain declared war against Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, many young men volunteered to take to the skies in defense of their nation. When war broke out in 1939, the Air Ministry employed the RAF Volunteer Reserve as the principal means for aircrew entry to serve with the Royal Air Force. A civilian volunteer, on being accepted for aircrew training, took an oath of allegiance and was then inducted into the RAF VR. By the end of 1941, more than half of Bomber Command aircrew were members of the RAF VR. Most of the pre-war pilot and observer NCO aircrew had been commissioned, and the surviving regular officers and members of the RAFO filled the posts of flight and squadron commanders. Eventually, of the RAF aircrew in the command, probably more than 95% were serving members of the RAF VR. The British were heavily involved in the aerial bombings during World War II, with a strong desire to fight back against Hitler, and viewed the RAF as their only real weapon to take revenge on the over 60,000 lives lost in Great Britain. Thus evolved the strategic bombing campaigns, and as Winston Churchill so aptly stated, Germany has sown the wind, and now they will reap the whirlwind.
Behind the armies and fleets of Britain and France gather a group of shattered states and bludgeoned races, the Czechs, the Poles, the Norwegians, the Danes, the Dutch, the Belgians, upon all of whom the long night of barbarism will descend, unbroken even by a star of hope, unless we conquer, as conquer we must, as conquer we shall. Today is Trinity Sunday. Centuries ago, words were written to be a call and a spur to the faithful servants of truth and justice. Arm yourselves, and be ye men of valor, and be in readiness for the conflict, for it is better for us to perish in battle than to look upon the outrage of our nation and our altars. As the will of God is in heaven, even so let him do.
Yet the costs and dangers of these aerial campaigns took a toll on many. In some cases, not a single bomber returned, and the average chances of survival were less than 40%. Yet the British were determined to stop the invasion of France. doing so by bombing bridges and then adding night bombings and focusing on factories which built U-boats and other implements of war. Miss Schrader's book, Moral Fibre, is a tribute to those fearless pilots and bombers who faced the foe head-on, taking to the skies to vanquish the dragon breathing fire over Europe.
Wings over England, but these are wings of the RAF, American-built bombers outward bound for daylight raids upon the continent. Raids to repay the Nazis tenfold for their wanton attacks upon defenseless cities. Crossing the channel, low flying makes it harder for enemy observers and sound detectors to spot them. Roaring in over the beaches, movie camera planted squarely in the nose of a bomber for a ringside seat in an actual raid upon Nazi-occupied France. Only complete mastery of the air makes possible these daring daylight forays. Interested only in military objectives, they wing on to a chemical plant making Nazi munitions, and the bombardiers lay their deadly eggs. Over channel ports now, blasting docks and installations with 1,000-pound bombs, and the camera records the damage. Back at a base in England, night raiders get their orders. They climb into fur-lined clothing. This time, the goal is Nazi Germany. The schedule of attack, 24-hour-a-day bombings around the clock. They carry feathered passengers, a homing pigeon for every bomber, to be released only if a ship gets into trouble. Sundown, the 0 hour. Powerful squadrons of 30-ton Lancasters are ready. Americans are among the crews, going with veterans of the RAF. At dozens of widely scattered aerodromes, blinker lights flash the signal for takeoff. And one by one, with split-second timing, 1,000 bombers roar down the runways, bound for the industrial cities of the German Reich. Visible through the haze, flying high above night clouds, they speed upon their deadly mission. Now, over the blacked-out objective, parachute flares light up the target amid a hail of anti-aircraft fire. Started by incendiaries flame like beacons. The city is ablaze.
But what were the Lancaster bombers and dam busters, and why did they play a key role in World War II? The Lancaster bombers and dam busters of World War II with the Royal Air Force were some of the most famous and celebrated aircraft in history. Developed in the early 1940s, these bombers were used extensively by the RAF in the strategic bombing of Germany. The most famous mission of the Lancaster bombers was the dam raids of May 1943, in which a group of RAF bombers successfully attacked the Möhne and Eder dams in Germany, causing massive flooding. The Lancaster bombers were a development of the earlier Manchester bomber, which was itself a development of the Wellington bomber. The Lancaster was larger and more powerful than either of its predecessors, and was equipped with 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The Lancaster had a maximum speed of 287 miles per hour and a range of 1,500 miles. The Lancaster bombers were armed with a variety of bombs, including the famous bouncing bomb developed by Sir Barnes Wallis. This bomb was designed to skip across the surface of water before detonating, causing damage to dams or other targets. The Lancaster bombers proved to be one of the most successful and effective aircraft of World War II. A total of 7,377 Lancasters were built, and the bombers saw action in many theaters of the war, including the strategic bombing of Germany, the D-Day invasion, and the bombing of Japan. The Lancaster bombers are considered to be some of the most famous aircraft in history and are celebrated for their role in the strategic bombing of Germany during the war. But what about the men who flew those powerful machines? The Lancaster bomber and dambuster RAF pilots of World War II were a group of brave and innovative men who played an important role in the war. They were responsible for some of the most heroic moments of the war, and their innovative tactics helped to win the war. Their bravery and heroism are an inspiration, and their story is one that will never be forgotten. Their feats were some of the most daring and impressive accomplishments of the entire conflict, and they became so skilled so as to hit targets without damaging nearby safe havens, such as the Nazi headquarters in Germany set between two hospitals, or blowing open a door in order for resistance prisoners to escape. Through their efforts, they helped turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies and pave the way for the eventual victory. In 2003, a statue of Guy Gibson was erected in Lincolnshire, and in 2012, a new Bomber Command Memorial was dedicated in London, both of which commemorate the sacrifices and heroism of the dambusters and all those who served in Bomber Command during the war. The dambusters are also the subject of several books, documentaries, and feature films, including the 1955 movie The Dambusters, which tells the story of the raid on the Moon Dam. But how did the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II help turn the tide? The RAF strategic bombing campaigns of World War II are some of the most successful in history. Their use of precision bombing techniques allowed them to destroy vital targets while minimizing civilian casualties. The campaigns were also aided by the development of new technologies such as radar and the Lancaster bomber. The RAF's strategic bombing campaigns began in earnest in 1940 with the bombing of targets in Germany. The most famous raid of the war was the bombing of the Nazi German city of Dresden in 1945. The RAF also played a significant role in the bombing of Japan in 1945. The Royal Air Force Bombers Command was responsible for carrying out night raids during World War II.
Britain's powerful Lancaster bombers preparing for another night raid on Nazi Germany. Raids calculated to smash the heart of the Nazi war industry. Away and over the sea they roar, loaded with bombs, each bomb big enough to blast an area of 10 city blocks. Coming in over the target. Tonight it's Essen, and the camera records the destruction. An unusual freak. A bomb is hit by anti-aircraft fire and explodes in midair, falling to Earth like a fiery comet. The RAF is softening up Nazi Europe for the day of reckoning.
Bomber Command had developed a number of different strategies for conducting night raids, and the most successful of these was the use of pathfinders to mark the target for the rest of the bombers. The bombers would fly in formation to the target and then release their bombs, often causing massive damage. The bombing of Dresden by British and American bombers in 1945 is an example of a night raid conducted by Bomber Command. The bulk of RAF Bomber Command were not engaged in precision bombing, but in area bombing. This was because the casualties for daytime bombing were unsustainable and unacceptable, 80 to 100% in the early years of the war. After switching to night bombing, the RAF did not have the technical capacity to hit targets at night with high precision. The RAF, therefore, of necessity, switched to area or carpet bombing. As a result, many accuse the RAF of atrocities and war crimes. The bombing of Dresden is generally used as an example of such an atrocity, not as a positive example of successful strategic bombing.
At Heidefriedhof Cemetery in Dresden. It reads, wie viele starben? Wer kennt die Zahl? An deinen Wunden sieht man die Qual der Namenlosen, die hier verbrannt, im Höllenfeuer aus Menschenhand. How many died? Who knows the count? In your wounds one sees the agony of the nameless, who in here were conflagrated, in the hellfire made by hands of man.
The Lancaster bombers and dam busters played a critical role in the liberation of Europe from Nazi control. The Lancaster bombers were used to bomb strategic targets such as factories, railways, and bridges. The dam busters were used to destroy key dams that supplied water and power to the Nazi war machine. Their efforts helped to cripple the Nazi war effort and pave the way for the Allied victory. The Lancaster bombers and dam busters are honored as heroes in the UK and around the world. Their efforts are credited with helping to save millions of lives and bring about the end of World War II. The best examples of successful strategic bombing in addition to the dam raids are the obliteration of the V3, a gigantic artillery battery in the Pas-de-Calais with the capacity to reach London. Attacks on the V1 and V2 launch sites, the destruction of the MAN factory in Limoges, France, without a single civilian casualty. 617 under the leadership of Leonard Cheshire, attacks on U-boat and E-boat pens and the destruction of the factory producing super-fast submarines in Hamburg. In World War II, the British Navy had a number of different ships and aircraft in their fleet. One of the most famous aircraft was the Spitfire, which was used in the Battle of Britain. However, the Navy also had a number of other aircraft, including the Lancaster bomber, the Sunderland flying boat, and the Mosquito. One of the most unusual aircraft in the Navy's fleet was the Channel Dash pilots. The Channel Dash pilots were a group of pilots who flew a number of different aircraft, including the Spitfire, the Lancaster bomber, and the Sunderland flying boat. They were specifically trained to fly these aircraft in the Channel Dash, which was a daring mission that involved flying from England to France and back in a very short period of time. The mission was so dangerous that many of the pilots didn't survive, but those who did were hailed as heroes. The Channel Dash pilots were an essential part of the British Navy during World War II, and their bravery and heroism will be remembered for years to come. Yet during the early years of World War II, around 5% of volunteer RAF pilots refused to fly due to the high number of casualties they were experiencing. In one instance, an entire squadron of pilots refused to fly after losing a number of their comrades. The RAF leadership was forced to ground the entire squadron. This type of behavior was not uncommon among RAF pilots, who were often unwilling to fly unless they felt they had a good chance of returning home safely. The high casualty rates among RAF pilots were a result of the fact that they were often flying missions during which they were greatly outnumbered by the enemy. In addition, RAF planes were often not as heavily armed as the planes flown by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The refusal of RAF pilots to fly resulted in a number of changes within the RAF. One change was the new pilots were no longer sent into combat unless they had completed a number of training missions. This was done in an effort to ensure that new pilots were adequately prepared for the challenges of aerial combat. Additionally, the RAF began to emphasize the use of radar and other technological advances in order to give pilots a better chance of avoiding and defeating enemy planes. While the refusal of some RAF pilots to fly may have helped to improve the morale of British citizens in a certain sense, as they imagined the refusal meant the war was soon to be won, it also resulted in a number of changes within the RAF that were designed to improve the safety of its pilots. Additionally, the refusal of RAF pilots to fly helped to ensure that new pilots were adequately prepared for the challenges of aerial combat. Yet the stigma of the label of LMF, lacking moral fiber, stung, and the consequences often followed many of the pilots for years after their service. This label, given to many who refused to fly, LMF, were given to those airmen who the RAF deemed as lacking the courage to face the enemy head-on. Most often, LMF was attributed to men who became airsick and were unable to complete their bombing missions. In some cases, however, LMF was used as a derogatory term for men who displayed cowardice in the face of danger. The term lacking moral fiber was first used in 1917 by the Royal Flying Corps to describe men who were not fit for duty. The term was later used by the RAF during the World War II to describe men who were not brave enough to face the enemy head-on. When a pilot received this label, he lost the confidence of the squadron, and oftentimes the commanding officer. After declaring he wanted the pilot off their hands, they sometimes just disappeared. Legends developed among those left in the ranks, and many of the disgraced men were humiliated in public ceremonies where their medals and badges were torn from their uniforms. Others were dishonorably discharged and sent to work in the coal mines, with their entire medical record expunged. While some of the treatment for these pilots who refused to fly were not actually as bad as the legends, the stigma still did the job in discouraging many from deciding not to fly. Oftentimes, an LMF pilot was sent to an RAF medical facility where he was interviewed by a psychiatrist who would see if they were actually LMF or if they were just trying to take advantage of the system. Statistically, 35% went back to flying, and another smaller percentage went back to other types of flying or ground duty. The stigma of a pilot being labeled lacking moral fiber in World War II was a heavy burden for many. This was due to the fact that being labeled as such could mean being discharged from the military and sometimes even lead to prosecution. However, many pilots who were labeled as such defied the stigma and continued to serve their country with distinction. One such pilot was John Derry. Derry was born in England in 1916. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1939 and was soon flying missions over Germany. In 1941, he was accused of disobeying orders and engaging in unauthorized activities. As a result, he was labeled LMF and discharged from the RAF. However, Derry continued to fly missions for the RAF, this time as a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was credited with shooting down 5 German aircraft and was eventually awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Despite the stigma of being labeled LMF, Derry continued to serve his country with distinction. He is a perfect example of how a pilot can overcome a negative label and perform heroically in combat. This story coincides with the story told in Ms. Schrader's book, Moral Fibre, about the fictional pilot Kit Moran. Kit was born in South Africa to a white father and mixed-race mother, leaving them behind to travel to the UK at 16. Without completing school, he volunteers for the RAF at the start of the war and qualifies as an aircraft mechanic, which he works as during the Battle of Britain. After volunteering for aircrew in 1942, he is trained to be a flight engineer, where he completes 1 tour of duty as a sergeant flight engineer and earns a Distinguished Flying Medal. At the end of his tour, he receives the King's Commission, a commissioned officer, a pilot officer in RAF ranks, the equivalent of a U.S. second lieutenant, and he volunteers for a second tour along with his pilot skipper, Flight Lieutenant USAF Captain Don Selkirk. On this second tour, Don is killed in an operational flight over Germany. It is after this event that Kit refuses to fly, is labeled LMF, and sent to a psychiatric center. The psychiatrist recommends for pilot training, and he returns to South Africa for training in January of 1944, then returning to the UK in August of 1944. Only now he is a pilot and a flying officer. Moral Fibre follows him from his return to the UK to the end of the war. His love interest in the story is a strong-willed, feisty young woman who rolls up her sleeves and takes on the responsibilities in the work arena, a true 1940s Rosie who perseveres through losing her first love to a bombing raid, then falling hard for his best friend Kit. She stands by her man through thick and thin and brave the possibilities of losing him in the fight as well. Schrader does an excellent job in weaving the emotional aspects of the characters into the historical fabric of what it meant to be a bomber during those days. In her book, she wanted to focus on these counterexamples of very successful precision bombings, which were carried out particularly by 617, 627, and 9 squadrons, showing what the RAF was able to do in the closing years of the war. This does not change the fact, however, that for much of the war, most of the RAF were engaged in area bombing, which caused high civilian casualties, as was mentioned. Yet the RAF bombers were a vital part of British victory in World War II. They were instrumental in the defeat of the Luftwaffe and played a major role in the strategic bombing campaign that destroyed German industry and morale. Without the RAF bombers, the war would have been much longer and much more costly. The RAF bombers were first used in large numbers in the Battle of Britain, where they were used to attack German airfields and factories. After the invasion, they continued to be used in the campaign to liberate Europe. For a more in-depth look at Helena P. Schrader's book, Moral Fibre, we at the Historical Fiction Company had the privilege of reviewing her book. Quotes such as this one stand out.
All the rumors about what happened to men like him who lacked moral fiber crowded into his brain: court-martial, demotion to aircraftman, assignment to humiliating duties such as cleaning latrines or working in the morgue, or a dishonorable discharge and industrial conscription to the coal mines or in a munitions factory. Whatever they did to him, the blot on his record would be forever.
Schrader's choice of title is as perfect a choice as one could hope for a historical novel. A title which weaves the thread of the theme through the entire lives of the characters involved. And not just the characters, but it also takes on a literary tone as the book calls to question the moral's moral fiber, especially in the light of the atrocities of war, racism, duty, and enduring love. What would a person do when faced with the innumerable choices raised in the midst of the chaos of all of these?
Don't plan on building a future here, Kit, his father warned. When the colonies go up in flames, you don't want to be anywhere on this continent.
At the outset, Officer Kit Moran faces a dilemma after being tagged as LMF, lacking moral fiber, after refusing to continue flying sorties after a dear friend is killed. Instead of the get back on the horse mentality, he chooses to suffer the consequences and tries to deal with the possibility that his career is over. After all, most LMFs are reduced to grunt work and suffer stark humiliation from other pilots, from family, and from former friends. But this is not his only concern, for he finds himself strongly attracted to his friend's fiance, and after spending some time at her parents' home in Yorkshire, their attraction for one another blossoms, and he is given the opportunity, quite unexpectedly, to return to operations and train a crew.
Kit didn't plan to die, but he couldn't escape the feeling that his chances of survival were poor. Statistically, more than half the men in this room would be dead before they completed their first tour. Kit's unease, however, extended beyond the statistics.
It is during these training sessions that a reader truly gets to know Kit Moran and his background, which brings to light the other issues he has faced all of his life as a young man growing up in South Africa, with a white British father and a black Zulu mother. The themes of injustice, tolerance, hatred, and resiliency in the face of the horrific racial genocide suffered by the Jews brings the core thread of a person's moral fiber to the forefront. Georgina, Kit's former friend's fiance, and now his true love, also shows her worth by sticking by him even with the weekly knowledge that every sortie he flies might be his last. She never wavers in her loyalty and love and looks beyond any possible strife the two of them might face as a mixed-race couple in the time period in which they live. The author's ability to draw in a reader is evident from the very first, with absorbing dialogue and first-rate scene setting, especially when the reader is able to soar through the heights as again and again Kit's crew bombs essential German targets over the enemy lines. You indeed get a sense of flying in these heart-pounding episodes full of incredible descriptive narration and real-life emotions, and not just with Kit's character, but with every one of the crew members, such as the handsome navigator Adrian, who has difficulty choking at very inappropriate moments and faces his own questions of lacking moral fiber. The research done for this type of book is immense, and while the endnote gives you full accounting of some of the author's knowledge of these cloud-bound battles, You can't help but feel as if she herself sat in the cockpit and experienced them firsthand in order to relay them in such a believable way to the reader. Very, very well done. This, along with the ability to charge the reader to look into themselves in regards to their own moral fiber, bringing up such questions as, when faced with racial injustice, will you stand up to the wrongness of this vice? When faced with life or death, will you show your courageous strength or cower ignobly? Will you stick by someone, showing the truest depths of love and loyalty, even when faced with possible tragedy? Or will you run away as a coward? All these this book tackles in a very authentic way, wrapping the theme in a lovely, heartwarming love story. Very highly recommended. Moral Fibre by Helena P. Schrader receives 5 stars from the Historical Fiction Company and the 2023 Highly Recommended Award of Excellence. You can get Helena P. Schrader's book Moral Fibre by clicking on the link in the description, and coming this summer, we will have another content episode featuring Ms. Schrader's next series, which deals with the Berlin airlift. Thank you for joining the History Bards podcast today. This is Dee Marley, and as always, keep making history and keep listening.